My parents disowned me for marrying a poor single father. My mother actually looked at his sweet little girl and called her extra baggage. For 5 long years, they acted like we were dead. Then my husband's cybersecurity company went public. Our net worth hit $55 million overnight. Suddenly, my mother showed up at my door with my sister and a literal list of demands. My husband read it, smiled, and said one word: perfect. Now my lawyer has proof. My mother stopped breathing. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who only love you when you are profitable. My name is Nia. I am 32 years old, and I work as a corporate public relations strategist. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in Chicago. The sunlight was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our downtown penthouse, illuminating the life Marcus and I had built from absolutely nothing. I was standing at the kitchen island, pouring myself a fresh cup of coffee, finally exhaling after a whirlwind week of celebrating my husband and his massive initial public offering success. Marcus was in his home office down the hall, and his 8-year-old daughter Maya was home in her bedroom for a scheduled school closure. Life felt peaceful. It felt safe and ours. Then the private elevator bell chimed aggressively. It was not a polite ring, but a frantic, entitled buzzing that echoed through the quiet marble foyer. I frowned, tightening the belt of my silk robe. Building security was supposed to announce all guests, especially in a building with this level of privacy. As I approached the heavy oak double doors, the chime blared again, accompanied by impatient, heavy pounding. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the handle back, expecting a confused delivery driver. Instead, the cold reality of my past crashed right into my present. Standing in my private foyer was a firing squad made up of my own flesh and blood. Vivian, my mother, stood at the absolute front. At 58, she still looked like she belonged on the board of every elite black society club in the city. She was wrapped in a pristine cashmere coat, her hair immaculately pressed, projecting that obsessive need for generational wealth and status she valued far above the well-being of her own children. Right beside her was my younger sister Chloe, 30 years old, the undeniable golden child, dripping in designer logos and staring at my foyer with a volatile mixture of intense jealousy and arrogant entitlement. Behind them stood Chad, Chloe's 34-year-old husband. He was a white hedge fund manager who carried himself with the kind of unbearable privilege that always made my skin crawl. He had always looked down on Marcus, treating him like the hired help instead of an equal, simply because Marcus started his business in a cramped apartment instead of a trust-funded incubator. And finally, hovering in the back like a shadow, was Jerome, my 60-year-old father. The man who never once raised his voice to defend me, and who always chose the path of least resistance. They did not wait for an invitation. Before I could even ask how they bypassed the front desk, Vivian pushed past me, her designer heels clicking sharply against my imported hardwood floors. Chloe followed, dragging Chad along while my father slipped in last, carefully avoiding my eyes. They marched straight into my living room as if they owned the building. Vivian stopped in the exact center of the room, looking out at the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. She took a slow, deliberate breath before turning to face me with a cold, calculating glare. She reached into her expensive leather tote and pulled out a thick, legal-looking document bound in a dark leather folder. With a swift flick of her wrist, she tossed it onto my custom glass coffee table. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud that seemed to vibrate through the entire room. I crossed my arms, refusing to let them see my heart pounding against my ribs. I walked slowly toward the living room, keeping my posture perfectly straight, drawing on every ounce of corporate crisis training I had ever mastered. I did not yell. I did not ask them to leave. I just stared at the leather folder, then up at Vivian. She lifted her chin, adopting the exact same tone she used to scold me when I was a teenager, failing to meet her impossible standards. She spoke with absolute authority, as if my penthouse was her personal kingdom, and I was merely a disappointing subject. "We have discussed this with Chad," she announced, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "We have decided on the terms of your readmission into this family. Sign the paper, Nia. $5 million is to be wired directly into Chad's investment fund by the end of business today." I blinked, genuinely stunned by the sheer audacity of her words. $5 million. They had ignored my existence for half a decade. They had missed my wedding. They had pretended I was dead to their social circle, and now they were demanding $5 million as a mandatory entry fee to their toxic club. They wanted me to just hand over a fortune to Chad, the same man who used to make passive-aggressive jokes about Marcus living in a dangerous neighborhood. Vivian was not finished. She smoothed the front of her coat, her eyes narrowing as she delivered the final blow. "If you sign it," she continued, her voice dripping with artificial grace, "this family will officially take you off the blacklist. We will forgive the fact that you embarrassed us by marrying that broke man. And as a gesture of my goodwill, I will allow your husband's extra baggage to appear in the family photo this Thanksgiving." The silence in the room was deafening. She was talking about Maya, my sweet, brilliant 8-year-old stepdaughter, who had brought more joy into my life than my biological family ever could. Vivian still saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience, a dark mark on her perfect family image that needed to be hidden away. I looked at Chloe, who was actively smirking, and Chad, who stood there with his hands in his pockets looking incredibly smug, as if he was doing me a massive favor by agreeing to wash my new money through his firm. A younger, weaker version of me might have screamed. I might have cried and demanded to know why I was never enough for them. I had spent my entire youth bending over backward to fit into Vivian's rigid mold of success, joining the right groups, dating the right people, shrinking my own personality, so Chloe could constantly shine as the favorite. I had endured decades of being the scapegoat because I preferred building my own career over marrying into an approved country club family. But I was not that girl anymore. I did not feel a single drop of anger. Instead, I felt an icy, terrifying calm wash over me, starting from my chest and spreading all the way to my fingertips. I slowly walked to the coffee table and picked up the leather folder. I opened it fully expecting to see a ridiculous one-sided contract drafted by Chad's overpriced corporate lawyers trying to legally bind me into a terrible investment. But as I flipped past the first heavy page, my eyes caught something else entirely. This was not a simple investment agreement. There were heavy blocks of text detailing financial demands and legal stipulations, but there were also attachments tucked at the very back of the document. I flipped to the final pages and my breath hitched sharply in my throat. Tucked beneath the financial demands were several printed photographs and digital data printouts. The images were heavily blurred, and the text was aggressively redacted, but I could clearly make out the subjects and the implied context. The papers detailed fabricated narratives and manipulated data logs, completely twisting the reality of Marcus and his company. It was a carefully constructed package of lies, designed to destroy a reputation just days after a major public offering. It was not a contract at all. I traced the edge of the thick paper with my thumb, my mind racing as the dark reality of their sudden morning visit finally crystallized in my mind. They were not here to offer forgiveness or to gracefully welcome me back into the fold. They were here to blackmail us. I stared at the blurred photographs and manipulated data logs inside the leather binder. The sheer malice of their plan was sinking in when Chloe scoffed loudly, breaking the heavy silence in the room. She was pacing the length of my living room, running her perfectly manicured fingers along the edge of my custom Italian sofa with a look of absolute disdain. She tossed her designer hair over her shoulder and let out a sharp, patronizing laugh. "Marcus really got lucky with that initial public offering," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "But let us be honest, Nia. Tech money is so volatile. One bad quarter and all of this disappears. Besides, new money can never buy actual class. You can live in a penthouse, but you cannot erase who he really is." I closed the folder slowly, setting it back on the glass table. I turned to face my sister, keeping my expression completely unreadable. "And who exactly is he, Chloe?" She rolled her eyes, exchanging a knowing smirk with our mother. "Please do not play dumb. Have you forgotten Dad's birthday party 5 years ago? The one where your brilliant tech genius showed up in a cheap suit carrying that little mistake of a child. Mom had to ask the catering staff to set up a folding table out in the garden just to keep them away from the real guests. The country club board members were there, Nia. We could not exactly have them mingling with a struggling single father and his out-of-wedlock baggage. You should be thanking us for trying to protect your reputation. The memory of that night hit me hard, but I refused to let her see the pain. I remembered Marcus holding Maya tight, keeping a brave smile on his face, to protect his little girl from the icy stares of my own family. I remembered walking out of the country club with them, leaving my untouched plate behind, vowing never to let them make my family feel small again. I watched Chloe as she admired her own reflection in the mirrored wall. She had always been like this. Every achievement I ever earned was minimized to keep her positioned as the pinnacle of Black excellence in my mother's eyes. When I graduated at the top of my university class, Vivian hosted a dinner party to celebrate Chloe getting a minor promotion at a lifestyle magazine. The narrative was always the same. Nia was the difficult one while Chloe was the masterpiece. Protecting my reputation, I asked, stepping closer to Chloe. You mean protecting Vivian's obsession with her social standing? Let us get the story straight. You all did not banish Marcus and Maya to the garden because they lacked class. You banished them because you were furious that I refused to marry the man Vivian handpicked for me. Vivian stiffened her posture, going rigid. I wanted what was best for you, Nia. The heir I chose came from a third-generation banking family. His family had pedigree. He understood generational wealth. He also had two separate restraining orders against him from his previous girlfriends. I shot back, my voice raising just enough to echo off the floor-to-ceiling windows. But you did not care about that, did you, Mother? You only cared about the optics. You cared that his grandfather owned a bank. You cared so much about those country club optics that when I told you I was marrying Marcus, you called your lawyers the very next morning. You completely stripped my name from the family trust. You froze my accounts and told the entire family I was suffering from a mental breakdown just to explain my sudden absence. Are you actually listening to yourself, Chloe? I asked, turning my attention back to my sister. You stand in a home that my husband bought with cash, and you still have the nerve to call him new money. Your entire lifestyle is funded by Vivian's credit cards and Chad's mysterious bonuses. Do not project your financial insecurities onto my husband. Chloe let out an indignant gasp. How dare you speak to me like that? I am your sister. You stopped being my sister the day you laughed while Vivian called Maya an unwanted burden, I replied, keeping my tone dangerously even. You stood right there in the garden and watched a 3-year-old girl cry because she did not understand why her grandfather would not look at her. You helped them cut me out of the family photos. You took my share of the inheritance and used it to buy that diamond tennis bracelet you are wearing right now. So do not stand in my penthouse and demand sisterly respect. You burned that bridge for a few pieces of jewelry. Vivian stepped between us, shielding Chloe as if I were the one launching an attack. You are being hysterical, Nia. This is exactly why I had to protect the family assets. You lack emotional control. You always let your feelings dictate your logic. If I had left your trust fund intact, you would have drained it to fund his little computer projects. We preserve that money for the rightful heirs who understand our legacy. Your legacy, I countered, my voice dropping an octave. Your legacy is built on pretending you are better than everyone else while drowning in secret debt. I know for a fact the country club dues have gone up, and Dad has been taking side consulting jobs just to keep up appearances. Do not talk to me about preserving legacy when you are begging for $5 million to stay afloat. Jerome, my father, finally shifted uncomfortably near the entryway. Nia, your mother was only trying to secure your future. We wanted to make sure you did not throw your life away on a sinking ship. I looked at the man who had stood silently by while my mother ripped my life apart. His silence was the loudest confirmation of his cowardice. He had always been a passenger in his own life, letting Vivian drive the family straight into a wall of superficiality. A sinking ship, I repeated, laughing coldly. That sinking ship just rang the bell at the New York Stock Exchange. That sinking ship just built a $55 million empire while your precious golden child Chloe married a man who spends his days gambling with other people's retirement funds. Chad's face turned a violent shade of red. He stepped forward, pointing a finger in my direction. Now listen here. I manage a top-tier hedge fund. My family has been in finance since before your grandfather was even allowed to open a bank account. You show some respect. The blatant arrogance in his voice The casual weaponization of his white privilege in the middle of my home was suffocating. Chad always carried himself as if his presence alone elevated our family status. He expected everyone to bow to his perceived superiority. I opened my mouth to tear into him, but the heavy oak door of the home office swung open. The sharp click of the latch immediately drew everyone's attention. Marcus walked out. The shift in the room's energy was immediate. Marcus did not storm in or shout. He simply walked with the quiet authority of a man who knew his exact net worth and his exact intellectual superiority over everyone else in the room. He was not wearing the cheap suit Chloe had just mocked. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal blazer over a crisp black shirt, exuding the effortless power of a man who actually built his wealth instead of inheriting it. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were deadly serious as they swept across the room, taking in the hostile invading force standing in our living room. He bypassed Vivian and Chloe, barely giving them a passing glance. His eyes locked onto the leather folder sitting on the coffee table. The blackmail documents. Chad saw an opportunity to establish dominance. He practically lunged forward, intercepting Marcus's path with that arrogant swagger. Chad reached out and clapped a heavy, patronizing hand onto Marcus's shoulder, squeezing it with aggressive familiarity. "Well, if it is not the man of the hour," Chad said, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "Nice little setup you have got here, Marcus. Not bad for a guy who used to fix laptops in a basement. But let us talk man to man. You had a lucky break with this public offering. A very lucky break. But holding on to that kind of capital takes a completely different pedigree. I have been managing assets since you were still trying to figure out coding basics, pal. You need the big boys to step in now. Tech stocks crash every day. Give me the 5 million. I will put it in a secure offshore portfolio and I will teach you how the real players stay wealthy." The tension was thick enough to choke on. Chad was banking on his privilege, expecting Marcus to fold under the pressure of old money financial jargon. He thought he could intimidate a self-made millionaire in his own home and simply bully him into handing over a fortune. Marcus slowly looked down at the hand resting on his shoulder. He did not say a single word. He just stared at Chad's fingers until the silence became so incredibly uncomfortable that Chad actually swallowed hard and pulled his hand back. Chad cleared his throat aggressively, attempting to mask the sudden evaporation of his physical dominance. He took a deliberate step back, smoothing the lapels of his custom navy suit. He adopted the stance of a seasoned professor, preparing to lecture a particularly slow student. He began pacing a slow, measured strut across my living room floor as if he had already purchased the property. "Listen to me, Marcus," Chad started, his voice oozing with a practiced patronizing warmth. "I understand you are feeling a little defensive right now. You had a massive liquidity event. You rang a bell. People clapped. You are looking at a bank account with more zeros than you ever thought possible for a guy from your background. It is intoxicating. It makes you feel invincible. But let us be absolutely clear about how the real world operates outside of Silicon Valley fairy tales." Chad paused, turning to look directly at Marcus, expecting my husband to be shrinking under the weight of his Wall Street vocabulary. Marcus stood perfectly still, his expression carved from stone. "Tech money is monopoly money, Marcus," Chad continued, gesturing vaguely with his hands. "It is entirely theoretical. It is built on algorithms and hype, and it can vanish the second a new competitor launches a better app. One bad quarterly earnings report, one scandal, one tiny glitch in your software, and that 55 million drops to 500,000. I have seen it happen 100 times to guys just like you. Guys who get a taste of real capital but have zero understanding of how to institutionalize it." Chloe nodded vigorously from her spot by the window. "Chad is right, Marcus. You should be taking notes instead of standing there acting stubborn. He manages portfolios larger than your entire company." "Exactly." Chad smiled, feeding off his wife's validation. "What you have right now, Marcus, is volatile lottery winnings. It is unrefined. It lacks pedigree. If you want to transition from a lucky developer to a man of actual substance, you need someone to wash this new money. You need it cleaned, stabilized, and embedded into the kind of legacy vehicles that protect it from your own inevitable mistakes." You need a wealth manager who knows how the elite class protects its assets. I watched Vivian beam with pride. My mother was practically glowing listening to Chad belittle my husband. She had always worshipped proximity to whiteness and perceived prestige. In her eyes, Chad was the ultimate prize, a hedge fund manager with a country club membership and a lineage untainted by the struggles of the working class. She was entirely blind to the fact that Chad was standing in my home, insulting the very man she was attempting to extort. "That is where I come in," Chad said, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial tone, as if he were granting us a magnificent favor. "The 5 million we are asking for is not a shakedown, Marcus. It is an initiation fee. You wire those funds into my flagship portfolio by the end of the day. I will personally oversee the allocation. I will diversify your exposure, lock it into municipal bonds, structured notes, and offshore trusts. I will teach you how real wealthy people play the game. I will make you legitimate. And in return, Vivian will gracefully overlook the undeniable damage your presence has caused to this family's social standing. It is a win for everyone." Chad crossed his arms, settling his weight onto his heels, looking incredibly satisfied with his own monologue. He truly believed he had just delivered a masterclass in negotiation. He expected gratitude. He expected Marcus to yield to the overwhelming pressure of his financial expertise and racial privilege. Marcus did not blink. He did not raise his voice. He did not defend his company or his background. He simply let the silence stretch out, allowing the sheer arrogance of Chad's words to hang awkwardly in the air. I watched my husband carefully. Marcus possessed a specific kind of quiet danger. He was a man who spent his days hunting down international cyber syndicates, analyzing behavioral patterns, and dismantling complex networks of fraud. He did not react to provocations, he analyzed vulnerabilities. Marcus's eyes drifted downward, conducting a slow, methodical assessment of Chad's exterior. He looked at Chad's shoes first. They were expensive Italian suede loafers, entirely impractical for the slush and snow currently melting on the Chicago streets outside. Then Marcus's gaze moved up to Chad's left wrist, lingering on the flashy rose gold Rolex Daytona, peeking out from beneath his tailored shirt cuff. It was a loud watch, a showy piece meant to scream wealth to anyone within a 10-foot radius. I knew exactly what Marcus was seeing. He was seeing a man desperately overcompensating, a man wearing his insecurities on his sleeve, a man trying far too hard to project an image of untouchable success. "Are you quite finished, Chad?" Marcus finally asked. His voice was devastatingly calm, a low, resonant baritone that immediately commanded the space. Chad's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he forced it back into place. "I am just trying to help you out of a tight spot, buddy. Take the lifeline while it is still being offered." Marcus took a single deliberate step forward. The casual grace of his movement made Chad instinctively stiffen. "I find your perspective on institutionalizing assets fascinating, Chad," Marcus said, slipping his hands casually into the pockets of his slacks, "especially coming from a man who prides himself on understanding the mechanics of the elite financial class. You talk a great deal about stability and pedigree. You talk about washing new money into legitimate vehicles." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his eyes locking onto Chad's with a predatory focus. "So tell me something, Chad. As a seasoned portfolio manager, how exactly do you handle a routine compliance sweep by the Securities and Exchange Commission?" The change in the room was instantaneous, though nobody else seemed to understand why. Vivian looked confused. Chloe frowned, crossing her arms tighter. Jerome shifted his weight, looking nervously between the two men. But Chad. Chad reacted as if Marcus had just struck him in the chest with a physical blow. Specifically, Marcus continued his tone conversational, but completely lethal. "I am curious about the SEC's recent unannounced inquiry into your flagship offshore fund, the one you just generously offered to place my money into. How does a legacy wealth manager explain a massive liquidity deficit during a surprise audit?" The color drained from Chad's face with alarming speed. His ruddy, confident complexion turned a sickly shade of gray in a matter of seconds. The arrogant posture, the puffed-out chest, the performative swagger, it all evaporated. He stood there paralyzed, staring at Marcus, as if my husband had just morphed into a ghost. I have no idea what you are talking about, Chad stammered. But his voice lacked all its previous volume and authority. It was thin and reedy. Marcus smiled, a cold, terrifying curve of his lips. Do you not? That is strange. Because an audit of that magnitude usually requires the fund manager to freeze all outgoing distributions. It usually causes a desperate, frantic search for fresh capital to plug the holes before the federal regulators demand to see the ledger. A desperate search for, say, $5 million in immediate liquid cash. Chad's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The pristine facade of the white upper-class savior was crumbling right in front of my eyes. I looked down at his hands. The same hands that had confidently clapped Marcus on the shoulder moments ago were now trembling so violently that the heavy gold cufflinks on his wrists rattled softly against each other. Why was a simple question about an SEC audit making this arrogant hedge fund manager shake like a terrified child? What exactly had Marcus uncovered in the digital footprints of my family's golden boy? Chad was practically vibrating with panic. The silence in the room had shifted from tense to suffocating. He looked completely trapped, unable to form a coherent sentence about the federal regulators Marcus had just casually mentioned. That was when Jerome finally decided to step out of the shadows. My father had spent his entire life playing the role of the peacemaker, which was really just a cowardly disguise for being Vivian's ultimate enabler. He cleared his throat, holding up his hands in a placating gesture as he stepped between Marcus and Chad. Now hold on just a minute, son, Jerome said, projecting that deep paternal voice he used to use to guilt-trip me into giving up my college savings so Chloe could have a lavish Sweet 16 party. There is absolutely no need for all this hostility. We are family. Family helps family. Jerome looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading. He was weaponizing his age and his status as my father to defuse the bomb Marcus had just activated. Nia, listen to me. Chad's fund is just experiencing a temporary liquidity bottleneck. It is a cash flow issue. It happens to the best financial firms in the world. He just needs a bridge loan to get through the end of the quarter. And Chloe, your little sister Chloe, is pregnant. He dropped the pregnancy announcement like a trump card, expecting me to gasp and immediately surrender my checkbook. Are you really going to stand there in your luxury penthouse and watch your sister lose her home? Jerome asked, his voice dripping with manufactured heartbreak. Just wire the $5 million, Nia. Do this one small thing for the family, and we will tear up that paper on the coffee table right now. We can put all this bad blood behind us and start fresh. A sickening twist knotted in my stomach. My father was using an unborn child as a bargaining chip to fund a white hedge fund manager's illegal financial mistakes. But his specific phrasing caught my attention. Tear up that paper. Why would they want to tear up what they claimed was a simple investment agreement? What exactly were they trying to hide in those redacted attachments at the back of the leather folder? I stepped around the coffee table and picked up the heavy binder again. Vivian lunged forward, trying to snatch it out of my hands, but I stepped back, holding it out of her reach. I flipped past the financial jargon and looked closely at the blurred photographs and the blocks of text beneath them. I read the fine print. It was not a contract. It was a drafted press release addressed to major tech journalists and national news outlets. My blood ran cold and then immediately boiled over. If funds are not transferred to the designated account by close of business. I read aloud, my voice shaking with a rage so profound it made the room temperature drop. I looked up at Vivian. You drafted a story claiming Marcus built his cybersecurity algorithm on stolen consumer data. You are threatening to leak a fabricated data breach to the press to tank his company's stock exactly 3 days after our initial public offering. Vivian crossed her arms, standing her ground with zero remorse. I am simply prepared to tell the truth about where he gets his information, Nia. The public has a right to know how a man like him suddenly makes $55 million overnight. It is my duty as a concerned citizen. I looked back down at the paper. There was a second drafted article beneath the first one. I read the headline and my vision literally went red. I could hear my heartbeat thumping in my ears. A pattern of abuse. I read, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Tech Chief Executive Marcus covers up domestic incidents involving his minor daughter. I stepped toward Vivian, crushing the thick leather folder in my grip. You are threatening to tell the world that my husband abuses Maya. You are going to use an innocent 8-year-old girl, my daughter, as leverage to cover up your son-in-law's financial crimes. You are going to accuse a black man of child abuse just to extort money from us. Vivian did not even flinch. She looked back at me with eyes so devoid of maternal warmth they could have frozen water. Maya is not blood, she stated matter-of-factly. Chloe is your blood. Your unborn niece or nephew is your blood. I am protecting my actual family, Nia. If you force my hand, I will hit send on those emails today. You know exactly how the world works. The media loves a scandal about a black man who got rich too fast. They will not wait for proof. His stock will plummet by morning, and Child Protective Services will be knocking on this very door before lunch. They will tear this beautiful little life you built to pieces. She smiled a tight, cruel expression that made my stomach turn. Pay the 5 million, Nia. It is a very small price to keep your husband out of a federal prison and your little stepdaughter out of the foster care system. The sheer evil of her threat shattered the last remaining ounce of composure I possessed. The realization that my own mother would weaponize systemic racism and weaponize the child welfare system against a little girl just to maintain her country club status was unforgivable. This was no longer a family dispute. This was a hostage situation. I gripped the thick parchment of the demand list, my hands trembling with violent fury. I grabbed the top of the pages, ready to rip the entire extortion packet into 100 pieces. I was ready to throw them all out of the floor-to-ceiling windows if I had to. I was going to physically drag Vivian out of my home by her pristine cashmere coat. But before I could tear the paper in half, a large, warm hand covered mine. Marcus stepped to my side. His touch instantly grounded me, pulling me back from the edge of a complete emotional explosion. He gently took the crumpled leather folder from my shaking hands and smoothed out the edges with absolute calm. He did not look angry. He did not look scared. Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his tailored blazer and pulled out a heavy silver Mont Blanc fountain pen. He held the pen in his right hand and slowly, deliberately clicked the cap off with a smooth metallic snap that echoed in the silent room. He looked at Vivian, then at Chad, and finally at Chloe. A terrifyingly serene smile spread across his face, illuminating the brilliant, calculating mind that had built a tech empire from the ground up. "So these are the terms of the transaction," Marcus said, his voice as smooth as glass. "Excellent." Vivian let out a long, dramatic sigh of relief, as if she had just successfully disciplined a pair of unruly toddlers. Her posture relaxed instantly, the sharp edges of her panic melting into a sickening display of triumphant arrogance. She adjusted the lapels of her pristine cashmere coat, casting a victorious glance at Chloe, who was already smirking so hard she looked like she had just won the lottery. They genuinely believed they had won. They looked at Marcus holding that silver fountain pen, and they saw a terrified black man buckling under the threat of institutional ruin. They thought his calm demeanor was just the silent surrender of a man who knew he was completely outmatched by Vivian's vicious social maneuvering. Vivian stepped forward, invading my personal space again, but this time her voice dripped with a terrifyingly sweet condescension. She reached out and patted my shoulder with a cold, stiff hand. "You see, Nia," Vivian said, her tone shifting to that of a benevolent matriarch, bestowing unearned grace upon a foolish child. "This is exactly why you need this family. You let your emotions run wild. You let your pride blind you to the reality of how the world operates. You thought you could just walk away from your legacy, marry a man with a messy past, and face zero consequences. But society does not work that way. The media does not care about the truth. They care about the narrative. And I have the power to write the narrative that destroys you, or the narrative that saves you." I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound clinical disgust. She was standing in my home, bragging about her willingness to orchestrate a modern-day lynching of my husband's character through the press. "You should be thanking me," Vivian continued, oblivious to the absolute hatred radiating from my eyes. "I am giving you a clean slate. $5 million is a drop in the bucket compared to what you stand to lose if I click send on those emails. I am offering you protection. I am offering your husband legitimacy. Once Chad processes that capital through his firm, Marcus will finally have a respectable financial footprint. He will not just be some overnight tech millionaire with a target on his back. He will be under the protective umbrella of Chad's generational wealth management. We are doing you a massive favor. We are washing the dirt off your money. Chloe clapped her hands together, a sharp, annoying sound that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. She stepped up right next to our mother, looking at Marcus as if he were a peasant who had just been granted an audience with the queen. "It is about time you learned how to play ball," Marcus Chloe sneered. "You always walked around with this ridiculous chip on your shoulder, acting like you did not need anybody. But look at you now. One little thread of a scandal and you are ready to sign the check. You should be grateful Chad is even willing to take your money. His clients are old money billionaires. They have wings of hospitals named after them. Chad is risking his own firm's pristine reputation by bringing in your volatile tech capital. You better make sure that wire transfer clears before the banks close today. I am tired of having to pretend I do not know you when my friends ask about my sister's embarrassing marriage. After today, we can finally tolerate your presence at Thanksgiving. Just make sure you tell that kid of yours to stay quiet and out of the way when the actual family is talking." My fists clenched so hard my fingernails dug deep into my palms. The casual cruelty she threw at Maya, the absolute venom masked as high-class etiquette, made me want to physically throw her through the glass balcony doors. I stepped forward, ready to unleash hell, but Marcus caught my eye. He did not say a word. He just gave me a single imperceptible nod. It was a silent command. "Wait, watch." Marcus had not moved to sign the document. He stood perfectly grounded, radiating that terrifying quiet energy. He did not look like a man who had just been backed into a corner. He looked like a predator examining a particularly slow and foolish prey that had just wandered directly into his trap. He held the heavy leather folder in his left hand and the silver fountain pen in his right. He did not look at Vivian. He did not look at Chloe. He completely ignored their entire gloating performance as if they were nothing more than background noise. Instead, Marcus focused his entire attention on the thick stack of papers. I used the tip of his pen to slowly flip past the drafted blackmail articles. He bypassed the threatening letters, the fake data breach, reports, the fabricated child services complaints. He flipped straight to the very last page of the document, the page outlining the exact terms of the financial transfer, the page that detailed exactly where the $5 million was supposed to be sent. The room grew uncomfortably quiet as Marcus took his time. Vivian's triumphant smile began to falter slightly. Chloe shifted her weight, crossing her arms over her chest. Chad, who had been standing quietly in the background trying to maintain his arrogant posture, suddenly looked very tense. The silence stretched out thick and heavy. Marcus let out a soft, low hum of amusement. It was a rich, resonant sound that cut right through the tension in the room. He tapped the silver tip of his pen against the thick parchment paper. Tap, tap, tap. "This is a very thorough document," Marcus said, his voice devoid of any fear or submission. "You clearly spent a lot of time putting together these fabricated press releases, Vivian. You really captured that sensational tabloid tone. But I am looking at the wire transfer instructions on this final page." Marcus took a slow, deliberate step toward Chad. Chad instinctively took a half-step back, his expensive suede loafers scraping awkwardly against the hardwood floor. The white hedge fund manager, who had spent the last hour acting like the absolute master of the universe, suddenly looked like a cornered animal. Marcus held the folder out, tapping the paper right on the specific banking details. "You are asking me to wire $5 million into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands," Chad Marcus said, his voice echoing with lethal precision. "That is a very specific routing designation. You stood in my living room 10 minutes ago and gave me a very passionate speech about institutionalizing my assets. You talked about municipal bonds and structured notes. You claimed my money needed to be stabilized inside your flagship portfolio to give me proper Wall Street pedigree." Marcus tilted his head, his dark eyes locking onto Chad's pale, terrified face. "But this routing number does not belong to a domestic hedge fund," Marcus continued. "This routing number belongs to a shell corporation registered in a notorious tax haven. You told my father-in-law that your fund was simply experiencing a temporary liquidity bottleneck. You told my wife that you needed a bridge loan to get through a rough quarter. But you do not wire bridge loans to the Cayman Islands to fix a domestic balance sheet. Vivian frowned, her perfect brow creasing with genuine confusion. She looked from Marcus to Chad and back again. Chad, what is he talking about? She asked, her voice losing its commanding edge. You said the money was going straight into the firm's primary holding account. You said it was a standard capital injection to cover the margin calls. Chad opened his mouth, but his jaw just worked soundlessly. Sweat was now visibly beading on his forehead, shining under the modern recessed lighting of my penthouse. He swallowed hard, tugging at the collar of his custom shirt as if it were suddenly choking him. Marcus smiled, and it was the most dangerous expression I had ever seen on my husband's face. It was the smile of a man closing a steel trap. He is not talking, Chad, because he cannot answer the question, Marcus said, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp whisper. You see, Vivian, your brilliant son-in-law is not asking for a capital injection to save a struggling portfolio. You do not wire $5 million to the Cayman Islands to fix a liquidity bottleneck. You wire money to the Cayman Islands when you are trying to hide it from the federal government. Marcus took one final step, closing the distance until he was standing inches away from Chad. He tapped the silver pen directly onto the routing number printed on the paper. An offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Chad, Marcus asked, the silence in the room amplifying each syllable. You said your fund is experiencing a liquidity bottleneck. But the truth is, you do not have the legitimate solvent fund. You keep selling us, do you? The accusation hung in the air for a fraction of a second before Chad completely exploded. His face, already pale from the mention of the Securities and Exchange Commission, suddenly flushed a violent, angry crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. He threw his hands up in the air, stepping toward Marcus with a manufactured sense of outrage that was entirely built on centuries of unchecked entitlement. Are you out of your mind? Chad shouted, his voice echoing sharply against the glass walls of my penthouse. Are you actually standing there in your tailored suit accusing me of fraud? Do you have any idea who you are talking to? I am a fourth-generation financial manager. My grandfather sat on the board of the Federal Reserve. I went to Wharton, Marcus. Wharton. I have degrees you could not even dream of touching. You think you can just run a quick background check and suddenly understand the complexities of high-level institutional finance. This is defamation. This is blatant slander, and I will have my lawyers sue you into oblivion before the market even opens on Monday. Chloe rushed to her husband's side, grabbing his arm as if he needed protection from the truth. She glared at Marcus with absolute disgust. How dare you, Chloe shrieked. Chad comes from one of the most respected families in the financial sector. He manages money for senators and foreign dignitaries. You are just a glorified computer repairman who got lucky with an app. You know nothing about how real money works. You are just intimidated because you know you will never have his pedigree. Vivian nodded eagerly, backing up her golden child and her pristine white son-in-law. She pointed an accusing finger at my husband. This is exactly what I warned you about, Nia. This man has no respect for authority or class. He feels threatened by Chad's background, so he makes up these wild, ridiculous accusations to make himself feel bigger. It is pathetic. Chad visibly fed off their validation. The support of my mother and sister seemed to inflate his deflating ego. He puffed out his chest and took another step toward Marcus, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate a man who had grown up fighting for his life on the south side of Chicago. Chad was relying on the oldest trick in the book, his absolute belief that his race, his background, and his expensive degrees made him inherently superior to any black man, regardless of that man's net worth. You listen to me, you arrogant street-level hacker, Chad sneered, lowering his voice into a vicious growl. You are way out of your depth. You do not interrogate a legacy firm. You do not question my routing numbers. You sign the paper, you wire the funds, and you thank me for validating your new money. If you utter one more word of this ridiculous conspiracy theory, I will personally make sure your little tech company is blacklisted by every major institutional investor on Wall Street. I will ruin you. I watched the entire spectacle, feeling a deep, sickening blend of rage and fascination. Chad was digging his own grave with a golden shovel. I was so blinded by his own privilege that he actually thought he could scream his way out of a trap Marcus had already locked shut. Marcus did not flinch. He did not step back. He did not match Chad's frantic yelling. Instead, Marcus simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sleek black remote. He did not say a single word to Chad. He just pressed one button. Behind us, the massive 85-inch television mounted on the living room wall flared to life. The sudden bright light made Jerome jump and caused Vivian to gasp and step back. "Chad Marcus," said his voice cutting through the room with the precise surgical calm of a seasoned predator. "You seem to be under the impression that my company creates consumer applications. You keep calling me a street-level hacker who got lucky with an app. That is an interesting assumption. It shows you did absolutely no due diligence on the man you came here to extort." Marcus turned slightly, gesturing toward the massive screen. "My company does not build social media platforms, Chad. We build predictive behavioral algorithms and encrypted financial tracking systems. We design the software that the federal government uses to hunt down corporate terrorists. My primary clients are not teenagers with smartphones. My primary clients are the Department of Defense, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Cyber Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The air in the room seemed to instantly evaporate. Vivian's jaw actually dropped. Chloe let go of Chad's arm, taking a slow, hesitant step backward as the reality of what Marcus just said washed over her. "My husband was not just a tech developer. I was the man who built the surveillance architecture used by federal agents to put white-collar criminals behind bars. And right now," Marcus continued, his eyes locking onto Chad's terrified face, "my software is reconstructing your financial trail from data preserved through the active regulatory inquiry." Marcus pressed another button on the remote. The screen shifted from a blank blue background to a massive, incredibly complex flowchart. It was a staggering web of digital transactions, highlighted in neon red and sharp white lines. Arrows pointed across global maps connecting domestic routing numbers to offshore shell corporations. It was a visual representation of financial movement so detailed it made my head spin. "Let us look at your Wharton degree in action," Chad Marcus said, projecting his voice so it filled the entire room. "This diagram represents the capital flow of your flagship portfolio over the last 18 months. You told my father-in-law that you were experiencing a minor liquidity bottleneck. But the math on this screen tells a very different story." Marcus pointed the remote at the top left corner of the screen, where a massive bold number glowed in bright red. $12 million. "You see," Chad Marcus explained, speaking slowly, so every single word landed like a physical blow. "A liquidity bottleneck happens when investments are tied up in slow-moving assets. But you did not tie up your client's money in slow-moving assets. You panicked during the market dip last year. You took $12 million of your client's capital and you dumped it into highly unregulated illegal derivative trading in an attempt to quickly cover your own terrible market predictions." Chloe gasped, bringing both hands up to cover her mouth. Jerome, my father, finally stepped forward, staring at the screen with wide, disbelieving eyes. Chad was shaking his entire body, trembling as he stared at the digital proof of his own financial treason. "And you lost it," Marcus continued, his voice ruthless and exact. "You vaporized $12 million of old money capital. You completely wiped it out. You have been running a shell game for the last 8 months, shuffling smaller accounts around to hide the massive crater in your primary ledger. But the Securities and Exchange Commission announced their surprise audit last week. They are coming to look at your books on Thursday." I looked at my mother. Vivian was gripping the back of the sofa, her knuckles turning white. The pristine image of her perfect son-in-law was burning to the ground right in front of her. "You did not come here to offer me a seat at the elite table," Marcus said, stepping closer to Chad, forcing the trembling man to look him in the eye. "You did not come here to wash my new money. You came here because you are drowning. You are staring down the barrel of a 20-year federal prison sentence for wire fraud and embezzlement. You needed $5 million in immediate, untraceable offshore cash to temporarily plug the bleeding in your Cayman Islands account, just long enough to survive the federal audit on Thursday." I stepped forward, placing myself right beside my husband. The puzzle pieces finally slammed together with sickening clarity. "You are not here for an investment," I said, my voice ringing out sharp and clear. I looked at Vivian, then at Chloe, and finally at the pathetic sweating man they had placed on a pedestal. You came here to extort us. You fabricated a story about my husband abusing my daughter, and you threatened to leak it to the press just to blackmail us into covering up your massive federal crime. You brought a ransom note into my house and tried to disguise it as a family favor. Chad could not speak. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically between the glowing evidence on the screen and the cold, unforgiving faces of Marcus and myself. The brilliant Wharton graduate, the fourth-generation financial legacy, the man who thought his whiteness made him invincible, was currently suffocating under the undeniable weight of his own criminal incompetence. The trap had fully snapped shut, and they had walked right into it, completely blind to the fact that they were trying to steal from the very man who wrote the code designed to catch them. Chloe lunged forward with a piercing shriek. She positioned herself firmly in front of Chad, as if her designer dress could somehow shield him from the glaring neon red numbers flashing on our 85-inch screen. Her perfectly contoured face was twisted in a mixture of blind denial and absolute panic. "Turn it off, Marcus," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the television. "Turn it off right now. You are fabricating this entire thing. You mapped out some fake charts on your little computer to humiliate my husband, because you know you will never have a fraction of his success. Chad is a genius. His clients adore him. You are just jealous." Vivian immediately rallied behind her golden child. The shock that had temporarily paralyzed my mother was entirely replaced by a venomous, indignant rage. She could not process the reality of Chad's failure. Her entire identity, her carefully constructed social narrative, was entirely dependent on the illusion of Chad's flawless white aristocratic excellence. To accept that Marcus was telling the truth meant accepting that her entire world was a fraud. "Shut that screen off immediately, Marcus." Vivian commanded, her voice vibrating with that familiar dictatorial tone she had used to control my father for 4 decades. "You are actively insulting this family in our own home. You think you can use your tech parlor tricks to disrespect my son-in-law. Chad's career is the absolute pride of this lineage. He represents the pinnacle of generational wealth. He took this family's financial standing to heights you could not even comprehend. You will not stand here and smear his name with these ridiculous cyber conspiracies." I had heard enough. I stepped directly in front of Vivian, blocking her view of Marcus and the screen. The air in the penthouse felt electric, completely charged with the impending detonation of a secret I had been holding onto for 5 long years. I reached over to the modern credenza near the entryway and picked up a thick manila envelope I had placed there earlier this morning. I walked slowly back to the custom glass coffee table and slammed the heavy stack of documents down right next to their pathetic blackmail folder. The sound echoed like a gunshot, cutting off Vivian's rant mid-sentence. "You are absolutely right, Mother," I said, my voice dangerously low, but projecting clearly across the silent room. "Chad's career is indeed the pride of this lineage. It is a stunning achievement. But you seem to have forgotten a very minor detail when bragging about his incredible rise to the top of the financial food chain. You conveniently forgot to mention exactly where his initial capital came from." Vivian stared at the manila envelope. The blood that had rushed to her face in anger suddenly drained away, leaving her looking completely hollowed out. She took a tiny, involuntary step backward. "What are you talking about?" Chloe snapped, her voice defensive but laced with a sudden creeping doubt. "Chad built his first fund with seed money from his grandfather's associates. He is self-made." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh that made Jerome flinch. "Self-made," I repeated, staring directly into Chloe's eyes. "Is that the bedtime story they told you, Chloe? Is that the fairy tale you repeat to your friends at the country club while sipping mimosas? Because the banking records sitting on this table tell a completely different story." I picked up the top document from the stack. It was a certified bank transfer ledger, complete with official notary stamps and dates tracing back to exactly 6 years ago. "Let us talk about generational wealth, Mother," I said, stepping closer to Vivian. "Let us talk about the family trust that grandfather set up for us before he passed away. You told the entire extended family that I was cut out of that trust because I refused to marry the man you chose for me. You told everyone that you froze my accounts to punish me for marrying Marcus. You painted me as the rebellious, ungrateful daughter who forfeited her inheritance because she was too stubborn to follow the rules. Jerome looked down at his shoes, completely incapable of making eye contact with me. He knew. He had always known. But that was a spectacular lie. I continued, my voice rising with righteous fury. You did not freeze my accounts because I was a disappointment, Vivian. You froze my accounts because the money was already gone. You had already drained every single penny. Chloe looked at our mother, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. Mom, what is she talking about? I did not wait for Vivian to answer. I held up the certified ledger right in front of Chloe's face. Let me break it down for you, little sister, I said, my words striking like physical blows. 6 years ago, Chad was just a junior analyst struggling to get his own hedge fund off the ground. He needed a massive injection of seed capital to prove he was a serious player to his wealthy white peers. His own grandfather refused to bankroll him because he knew Chad was reckless. So Chad came crying to Vivian. And Vivian, being utterly obsessed with buying her way into his aristocratic circles, decided to play the savior. I turned my intense gaze back to my mother, watching the sheer panic finally shatter her perfectly composed exterior. You forged my signature, Mother, I said, the truth ringing out with devastating clarity. You used your status as the primary executor of the estate to bypass the secondary authentications. You liquidated my entire college tuition fund. You emptied the inheritance grandfather specifically left for me to start my own business. You took every dime I had to my name, and you quietly handed it over to Chad. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Chad was staring at Vivian, a look of terrified realization dawning on his face as the pieces of his own fraudulent origin story were dragged into the light. You stole from your own daughter. I continued, refusing to give her a single second to breathe. You sacrificed my future, my financial security, my entire foundation just to create a secret dowry for Chloe. You stole my life savings so you could roll out a red carpet of cash and buy your golden child a front row seat into Chad's world of white privilege. You bought his acceptance with my money. Vivian's mouth opened, but she was completely paralyzed. The arrogant matriarch who had marched into my home demanding $5 million was now completely exposed as a common thief. She had spent my entire life making me feel inadequate, making me feel like an ungrateful burden, while secretly using my birthright to fund the very man who was now standing in my living room trying to extort my husband. You called Marcus a sinking ship, I said, my voice vibrating with a cold, ruthless power. You looked down on us because we had to build our lives from scratch. But the only reason I had to start from scratch is because you robbed me blind to fund a fraud. Chad is not a financial genius, Mother. He is a parasite. He started his career by losing my stolen inheritance, and now he is ending his career by losing $12 million of his client's money. I dropped the certified ledger onto the glass table, letting the heavy silence amplify the absolute destruction of their false reality. Vivian stood completely frozen, her chest heaving as she stared at the undeniable proof of her ultimate betrayal. She had absolutely nowhere left to hide. Then the quietest person in the room finally decided to speak. Jerome stepped out from the shadows near the entryway. My father had spent my entire life perfecting the role of the helpless bystander. He was the man who always looked away when Vivian tore me down. The man who always conveniently had to check the score of a basketball game when Chloe demanded my belongings. He walked toward the center of the living room, holding his hands up in a gesture of peaceful surrender. His face was arranged in that familiar, sorrowful expression he always used when he wanted me to swallow my pride and apologize for things I never did. He approached the glass coffee table and looked at the bank ledgers and the blackmail documents. He sighed heavily, rubbing the back of his neck as if the weight of the world had just been placed on his shoulders. Nia, sweetheart, Jerome began, his voice low and soothing, vibrating with that practiced paternal warmth. Let us all just take a deep breath. We are getting entirely too worked up over things that happened in the past. Yes, mistakes were made. Your mother made a severe error in judgment with the trust fund, but she did it because she wanted to see our family grow. She wanted to secure a strong foundation for your sister. And Chad, well, Chad got in over his head in a very aggressive market. High as a young man carrying a lot of pressure, he made a terrible miscalculation. I stared at him, absolutely mesmerized by the sheer audacity of his vocabulary. A severe error in judgment, a terrible miscalculation. He was actively rebranding grand larceny and federal wire fraud as simple everyday oops moments. Jerome took another step toward me, his eyes pleading. But Chad has given me his word, Nia. He promises to pay back every single penny of your inheritance the second the market recovers. He will pay it back double. You have my word on that. We can draft a promissory note right now. Just wire the $5 million to fix this immediate crisis so he does not go to prison. Look at your sister Nia. Look at Chloe. She is pregnant. She is carrying your niece or nephew. Are you really going to let her husband be dragged away in handcuffs? Are you going to let your own mother face criminal charges for a desperate financial decision? We are family, Nia. Family forgives. Family protects its own. Please help your sister. For 32 years, I had given this man the benefit of the doubt. I had convinced myself that Jerome was just a victim of Vivian's domineering personality. I used to tell myself that he loved me, but was simply too weak to stand up to his wife. I used to cherish the rare moments when Vivian was out of the house and he would sit with me on the porch asking about my day. I had protected his image in my mind because it was too painful to admit that both of my parents were monsters. I looked at his soft, pleading eyes and felt a sudden violent wave of nausea. You want me to protect the family? Dad, I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. You want me to save Chad from the consequences of his own arrogant federal crimes? You want me to save the man who just stood in my living room and spoke to my husband like he was a subordinate? Jerome nodded eagerly, completely missing the venom in my tone. Yes, exactly, sweetheart. We just need to stick together. I turned to Marcus. My husband did not say a word. He simply reached into his tailored blazer and pulled out a small black tablet. He tapped the screen once and handed it to me. I took the tablet and looked back at my father. You talk a lot about protecting family, Jerome. I said, dropping the title of Dad permanently. You talk about protecting Chloe's unborn child, but you seem completely willing to sacrifice another child to make that happen. Jerome's sorrowful expression faltered, his brow furrowed in confusion. I am just trying to keep the peace, Nia. I do not want anyone to get hurt. That is a fascinating lie, I said, holding up the tablet. Because this screen displays a complete digital forensic trace conducted by my husband's cybersecurity team. When Marcus saw the drafted press releases in your blackmail folder, he noticed something very specific about the metadata on those printed pages. The pages threatening to leak a fabricated story about Marcus abusing Maya. The pages threatening to trigger Child Protective Services to take my 8-year-old stepdaughter away from her father. Vivian shifted uncomfortably, clearly thinking she was about to take the fall for the blackmail scheme. But I kept my eyes locked entirely on Jerome. Vivian may be a greedy, status-obsessed thief. I continued, my voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. But she does not know the first thing about digital media distribution. She does not know how to bypass spam filters for national tech journalists. She does not know the specific legal terminology required to trigger a fast-tracked investigation by the Department of Children and Family Services. The color began to drain from Jerome's face. The paternal warmth vanished, completely replaced by a stark, naked terror. But you do, I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the man who helped create me. You spent 30 years working as a senior communications director for the state government. You know exactly what kind of language forces a child welfare agency to act immediately without verifying the evidence first. You know exactly which tabloid editors will publish a smear campaign without checking their sources. Jerome took a step backward, shaking his head. Nia, you are confused. I had nothing to do with that folder. I looked down at the tablet and began to read aloud. Let us see. From the encrypted email address, jw1962@securemail.com. Sent exactly 4 days ago to the senior editor of the Chicago Tribune. Subject line: confidential tip regarding tech executive Marcus and minor child Maya. The body of the email reads, I have verifiable proof of ongoing domestic disturbances at this residence. The child is in immediate danger. If you guarantee my anonymity, I will provide the police reports. I looked up from the screen, staring into the eyes of a complete stranger. You used an encrypted server thinking it would hide your identity. But you forgot who my husband is. Marcus's software traced the origin of that email straight back to the IP address of your private home office in the suburbs. You routed it through 3 different virtual private networks, but the digital signature matches the exact device you use to check your golf scores every Sunday morning. Chloe gasped, pressing her hands over her mouth. Even Vivian looked genuinely shocked, staring at her husband, as if she had never seen him before. She might have wanted the money, but Jerome was the architect of the destruction. You wrote the blackmail, Jerome. I stated the absolute truth, ringing off the glass walls of the penthouse. Vivian brought the folder, but you were the mastermind. You sat at your desk in the house where I grew up, and you meticulously drafted a plan to destroy an innocent 8-year-old black girl. You explicitly targeted a child who has already lost her biological mother. You decided to weaponize the child welfare system against a black father fully aware of how devastating and dangerous that system can be for people who look like us. My voice began to tremble, but not from sadness. It was pure, unadulterated rage. And you did all of this? I shouted, the sheer volume of my voice making Chad flinch. Why? To protect a white hedge fund manager who lost $12 million playing illegal financial games. You were willing to throw my black daughter to the wolves. You were willing to let her be dragged out of her home by social workers screaming and terrified just to cover the debts of a white man who openly disrespects you. You sold out your own blood, your own people, to protect his privilege. Jerome was physically trembling now. The facade of the weak, passive father was entirely shattered, revealing the cold, calculating coward hiding underneath. He held his hands out, his palms sweating. Nia, please, you have to understand the pressure I was under. Vivian was screaming about losing the country club membership. Chad was threatening to expose our personal debts. I panicked. I just needed leverage. I never intended to actually send the emails to the police. It was just leverage. You used a child as leverage, I said, my voice dropping into a deadly, venomous whisper. You targeted my daughter. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, putting physical space between myself and the man standing in front of me. I looked at Vivian, staring wide-eyed at the stolen bank ledgers. I looked at Chloe, clutching her useless designer purse and crying over her husband's impending federal prison sentence. I looked at Chad, the arrogant fraud, sweating profusely as his entire world collapsed. And finally, I looked at Jerome, the hypocrite, who was willing to destroy a little girl's life to save face at a country club. For 32 years, I had craved their approval. I had cried over their rejection. I had wondered what was fundamentally wrong with me that made my own family treat me like an unwanted burden. But standing here looking at the absolute moral bankruptcy rotting inside every single one of them, the truth finally set me completely free. There was no love in this room. There was only transaction and betrayal. I handed the tablet back to Marcus and crossed my arms over my chest. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of peace. The last lingering thread of obligation, the final ounce of sympathy I held for my biological family, snapped cleanly in half. They were not my family. They were a cartel of thieves and manipulators who had just walked into the wrong building. My family was standing right next to me, holding a silver fountain pen and the digital keys to their absolute destruction. I turned my back on Jerome, refusing to look at his pathetic, weeping face for one more second. I was completely finished. The time for negotiating was over. Now it was time for the execution. I looked at Marcus and gave him a single, sharp nod. Finish it, I said. Finish them all. Vivian shattered the heavy silence with a piercing, desperate shriek. The absolute reality of her situation was finally crashing down around her, but instead of surrender, her narcissism triggered a violent defensive explosion. She pointed a manicured finger at the massive television screen, her face contorted into an ugly mask of pure denial. Do you actually have any real proof? Vivian screamed, her voice cracking under the intense strain of her own panic. You think you can just stand there and throw these wild accusations at us? All of this is just stupid charts on a television. You generated some fake graphics to scare us. That is all this is. A pathetic tech parlor trick. I dare you to sue us, Marcus. I absolutely dare you. She took a step forward, trying to reclaim the physical space she had lost, her chest heaving as she doubled down on her delusion. You think a federal judge is going to look at some colorful lines on a screen and throw me in jail, Vivian scoffed, letting out a harsh, breathless laugh. You think the police are going to take the word of a newly rich street kid over a pillar of this community. I sit on the board of 3 different charitable foundations in this city. My family name commands respect. I have lawyers on retainer who will tie you up in court for the next decade. They will bury you in litigation until you are completely bankrupt. You have absolutely no tangible proof tying me to anything. I watched her flail. It was the frantic, pathetic thrashing of a manipulator who had finally run out of victims to control. She was banking on her social status and her pristine public image to act as a shield against federal crimes. She genuinely believed that her country club memberships made her completely immune to the law. Marcus did not raise his voice to match her screaming. He did not argue about the validity of his software or the accuracy of the digital forensic trace. He simply let her exhaust herself until her screams faded into heavy, ragged breathing. Then my husband smiled. It was a slow, terrifyingly calm expression that radiated absolute total victory. Marcus turned his back on Vivian for a brief moment, walking slowly over to the custom glass coffee table. He reached down and picked up the thick leather folder containing the blackmail demands. The very same folder Vivian had thrown down with such extreme arrogance when she first marched into my penthouse. He weighed the heavy document in his hand, tracing the edge of the leather binding. "You make a very valid point," Vivian Marcus said, his tone dangerously conversational. "Digital evidence, while incredibly precise, can sometimes be a tedious thing to explain to a jury. Defense attorneys love to argue about data manipulation and unauthorized server access. You are absolutely right that courts prefer hard, physical, tangible evidence. They love things they can hold in their hands. They love paper trails." Marcus opened the folder. He slowly bypassed the fabricated press releases, the fake domestic disturbance reports, and the threatening letters. He went straight to the very last page of the thick document. "You see," Vivian Marcus continued, his eyes scanning the final page, "you were so incredibly confident in your own absolute superiority today. You walked in here believing you were untouchable. You treated this vicious extortion attempt like a formal corporate acquisition. Your obsessive need for control, your desperate need to ensure you got your exact payout, blinded you to the basic rules of committing a felony. You wanted everything documented to make sure Nia and I could not back out." Marcus turned to face the room, holding the document up so the ambient light caught the fresh, dark ink at the bottom of the page. "And that arrogant, obsessive need for a paper trail is exactly what is going to put you all behind bars," Marcus stated, his voice ringing out with lethal authority. Chad let out a choked, gasping sound. The color completely drained from his face as his eyes locked onto the bottom of the document. He suddenly realized exactly what Marcus was holding. "Let us review the contents of this final page," Marcus said, tapping the paper. "Right here at the top we have the explicit demand for $5 million. Directly below that we have the routing number for an offshore shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. A routing number that my federal contacts are already actively investigating for international money laundering and wire fraud." Marcus took a slow, deliberate step toward the group. "But the most fascinating part of this document," Marcus continued, lowering his voice into a chilling whisper, "is the bottom section. You did not just drop off an anonymous threat, Vivian. Your arrogance demanded formal acknowledgement. You wanted to make sure this blackmail was binding, so you included a signature block." Chloe let out a sharp, terrified whimper. She grabbed Chad's arm, but Chad was completely paralyzed, staring at the paper like it was a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. "And look at this," Marcus said, feigning surprise. "We have two beautiful, distinct signatures right here in wet blue ink." Marcus pointed to the first signature. "Here we have Chad confirming his active participation in a conspiracy to extort funds while directing the payment into the Cayman Islands account tied to the $12 million hole in his portfolio. His own signature connects the blackmail demand to the offshore destination the regulators are already examining." Chad's knees physically buckled. He stumbled backward, crashing heavily into the side of the designer armchair. His white privilege, his Ivy League education, and all that generational arrogance shattered into a million useless pieces. He gripped his chest, struggling to pull air into his lungs. Marcus shifted the page so Chloe could see the empty space where her name did not appear. "You did not sign this demand, Chloe," he said. "But your threats, your approval of the smear campaign, and your demands for money are all preserved with the evidence." Chloe recoiled as if the paper had burned her. "I did not write it," she shrieked, turning toward Vivian. "You told me this was pressure to make them invest. You said nobody would send those stories if they paid. I never agreed to this." Marcus cut her off with a hard look. "Then stop inventing a signature that is not there. The record will show exactly what you said and did." He moved the page toward Jerome. "Your name is not on this signature block either. Your problem is separate. The metadata from the smear emails traces the threats about Maya back to your home office. This paper proves who carried the demand. The digital trail proves who designed the weapon." Jerome covered his face with his hands, letting out a miserable sob. He sank onto the sofa, defeated because the missing signature did nothing to erase his forensic trail. Then Marcus stepped directly in front of Vivian. "And here is the second signature, the primary one, signed and dated today by the woman who personally delivered this demand." Marcus held the paper near Vivian's face, forcing her to stare at her handwriting beneath the Cayman routing instructions. "You signed a ransom note," Vivian, Marcus said without mercy. "Chad signed beside you. The $5 million demand, the fabricated stories about Maya and Marcus, and the offshore account sit on one document. You brought us the evidence yourselves." Marcus looked down at Chad with profound disgust before turning his attention back to Vivian. My mother was standing completely frozen. Her chest was barely rising. Her eyes were wide with a stark, unimaginable terror. The reality of her situation had finally broken through her delusion. She had no lawyers who could fix this. She had no country club friends who could save her. She had meticulously built her own prison cell and locked herself inside. Marcus carefully folded the heavy parchment paper. He did not rush. He made sure every crease was perfect before he reached up and slid the folded document securely into the inside breast pocket of his tailored blazer. He patted the pocket flat, his dark eyes locking onto Vivian's terrified face. "Dear mother-in-law," Marcus said, a terrifyingly calm smile touching the corners of his mouth. "I do not need to prove anything. You brought the evidence directly to me with your own hands." Chad finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. The absolute reality of his federal crimes shattered whatever delusional confidence he had left. He looked at the folded piece of parchment resting securely in Marcus's breast pocket, and his eyes went completely feral. He was no longer a sophisticated hedge fund manager, operating from a place of supreme generational entitlement. He was a desperate, cornered animal, staring directly at the exact weapon that was going to end his life of luxury and throw him into a federal penitentiary. Chad let out a guttural sound that was half scream and half sob. He launched his entire body weight forward, completely abandoning any pretense of upper-class dignity. He lunged directly at my husband, his hands clawing wildly toward the tailored fabric of Marcus's suit jacket. Chad actually thought he could just rip the document away and swallow it or tear it into shreds. He truly believed he could just erase the physical evidence with brute force and walk out of our penthouse as a free man. Marcus did not even break a sweat. He had anticipated the physical attack the very second he saw Chad's pupils dilate with panic. As Chad barreled forward, Marcus simply shifted his weight, stepping cleanly and efficiently to the side. He grabbed Chad by the lapels of his overpriced custom navy suit, using the heavier man's own reckless momentum completely against him. With one swift, fluid motion, Marcus swept Chad's legs out from under him and slammed him directly into the floor. The impact shook the thick glass of the custom coffee table. Chad hit the imported rug hard, all the breath rushing out of his lungs in a loud, pathetic wheeze. Before Chad could even attempt to scramble back up, Marcus planted his knee firmly between Chad's shoulder blades, pressing him flat against the floor. He pinned the arrogant wealth manager down with the effortless grace of a man who had grown up fighting for survival on the south side of Chicago. I watched the brilliant white savior of our family, pinioned to the ground, gasping for air like a fish out of water. This was the man Vivian had worshipped. This was the man who used to make passive-aggressive jokes at Thanksgiving about Marcus lacking the refined temperament required for high society. Now that refined gentleman was eating carpet in my living room, completely subdued by the very man he considered beneath him. The physical manifestation of Chad's unchecked privilege was being crushed under my husband's knee, and it was the most glorious thing I had ever witnessed. Marcus leaned down, keeping his voice remarkably conversational despite the physical exertion. He spoke directly into Chad's ear, ensuring every single word registered with crystal clear precision. "Let me explain exactly what you just did," Chad Marcus said, his tone devoid of any mercy. "You did not just commit a casual white-collar misdemeanor. You orchestrated a targeted defamation campaign to extort $5 million from the chief executive officer of a publicly traded company. You provided a documented international routing number that is heavily monitored for money laundering. And then you were arrogant enough to sign your full legal name in wet ink at the very bottom of the page." Marcus pressed his knee down just a fraction harder, making Chad groan in pain. "You just handed the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation the exact kind of evidence prosecutors build cases around." Marcus continued, his voice cold and controlled. "A signed demand tying threats against the chief executive of a publicly traded company to an offshore account does not become a misunderstanding because you hire expensive lawyers. Once investigators match this paper to the recorded threats, the $12 million loss, and the Cayman Trail, they can pursue extortion, wire fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. You wanted $5 million to survive Thursday's audit. Instead, you documented why federal investigators were already watching you." Chloe began screaming hysterically. She fell to her knees beside her husband, clawing uselessly at Marcus's arm, trying to pull him off. "Get off him!" Chloe shrieked, her perfect makeup now completely ruined by streams of dark tears. "Leave him alone, Marcus. We were just trying to survive. We did not know the offshore account was flagged. We just needed the money." I stepped forward, grabbing Chloe by the wrist and pulling her back sharply. "You do not get to play the victim, Chloe," I said, my voice slicing through her pathetic cries. "You were perfectly happy to ruin my husband's life an hour ago. You were smiling when Vivian threatened to call Child Protective Services on an innocent little girl. You loved the idea of destroying my family to fund your lavish lifestyle. So do not cry now just because your husband was too stupid to realize he was trying to rob a cybersecurity expert." Vivian was pacing the room, her hands gripping her hair. She looked completely unhinged, all her careful aristocratic grooming destroyed by the terrifying reality of imminent prison time. She had spent her entire life curating a pristine image for the black elite social clubs, and now she was staring down the barrel of a highly publicized federal indictment. "Nia, please," Vivian begged, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. "Tell him to let Chad up. We will leave right now. We will never contact you again. We will walk out that door and pretend none of this ever happened. Just give us the paper back, Nia. I will sell the house. I will sell my jewelry. I will liquidate my entire retirement portfolio and find a way to pay back the trust fund money I took from you. I will give you everything back. Just please do not give that document to the police. I cannot go to jail, Nia. I would not survive it. You cannot buy your way out of this." "Vivian," I said, crossing my arms and staring at the woman who had made my childhood a living nightmare. "You cannot sell your designer bags to pay off the federal government. You think you can negotiate with the law the same way you negotiate with country club boards, but you are wrong. You crossed a permanent line the moment you threatened Maya. You decided to weaponize the system against a black child to save your white son-in-law. You were willing to let a little girl be ripped from her home just so you could maintain your social status. There is no amount of money on earth that can fix what you broke today." Jerome was still sitting on the sofa, rocking back and forth, clutching his chest, as he muttered incoherent apologies to nobody in particular. The entire alliance of toxic abusers had completely fractured, turning into a room full of terrified individuals, realizing their lives were effectively over. Marcus stood up, stepping away from Chad and smoothing his suit jacket as if simply brushing off a bit of lint. Chad stayed on the floor, coughing and curling into a fetal position, totally defeated. He did not even try to stand up. The arrogance had been entirely beaten out of him. Marcus walked over to the smart home control panel mounted on the wall near the television. He tapped the sleek glass interface twice, bringing up a secondary menu. "You all seem to fundamentally misunderstand the timeline of this situation," Marcus said, addressing the panicked room without looking at them. "You are begging us not to go to the authorities. You are offering me money and apologies under the assumption that this is still a private family dispute. You think you still have time to stop the bleeding." Marcus looked at the massive 85-inch screen, which was still displaying Chad's fraudulent financial web and the $12 million deficit. Computer Marcus said, his voice echoing clearly through the penthouse sound system. Switch the primary display to active secure channel 1. The neon red charts instantly vanished from the massive screen. The display blinked to pure black for a split second before shifting into a live high-definition video feed. The connection tone chimed loudly through the room, indicating an active two-way call had been running the entire time. A man in a sharp blue suit sitting in a sterile government office appeared on the screen. The golden seal of a federal agency was clearly visible on the wall behind him, and a small red recording icon blinked in the top corner of the feed. I looked at the television screen, then back at Vivian, whose eyes were practically bulging out of her skull. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. We were not threatening to call the authorities. They were already on the line. "Good afternoon," Marcus, the man on the screen, said, his voice crisp and entirely professional. "I am an enforcement investigator with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Sitting beside me is your private corporate counsel. We have maintained a secure, unbroken audio feed of this entire interaction for the past 45 minutes. I can confirm we have a clear recording of the $5 million demand, the threats involving Maya, and the verbal confirmation of the Cayman Islands routing instructions." Marcus's private counsel leaned into the camera frame, his expression completely deadpan. "We also have visual confirmation of the signed physical demand, Marcus. The enforcement team has already coordinated with federal authorities and Chicago police to secure the document and execute the warrants prepared from the broader investigation. Officers are moving to your location now to take custody of the evidence and the named suspects." The live feed continued running, but the silence in my penthouse was absolute. The sheer weight of the federal government had just dropped squarely onto the shoulders of my toxic family. They had spent the last hour acting like they were the untouchable elite, writing their own rules and manipulating lives for sport. Now they were starring in a live broadcast to federal regulators who were coming to lock them in cages. Chloe was the first one to completely shatter. The reality of the situation bypassed her usual arrogant denial and struck her right in the chest. She looked at the television screen, then down at Chad, who was still sprawled on my imported rug, clutching his ribs. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy white husband completely dissolved. She was not married to a Wall Street titan. She was married to a broke, desperate fraudster who had just dragged her into a federal extortion conspiracy. "Where is the $12 million, Chad?" Chloe shrieked, her voice pitching so high it cracked. "Where is the money you promised me? You told me the fund was returning record profits. You told me we were closing on the summer house in Martha's Vineyard next week. Where is the money?" Chad scrambled backward, trying to put distance between himself and his hysterical wife. He looked absolutely pathetic, sliding across the floor in his expensive Italian loafers, his custom suit wrinkled and stained with sweat. "It is gone, Chloe," he stammered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "I told you I tried to fix it. The market shifted unexpectedly. I leveraged the primary accounts to cover the margin calls and the algorithms failed. I lost it. I lost everything. We have nothing left. We are completely bankrupt." Chloe let out a visceral, blood-curdling scream. All her country club etiquette, all her manufactured grace vanished in an instant. She threw herself at Chad, swinging her arms wildly. She slapped him hard across the face, the sharp crack echoing through the room. Her heavy diamond tennis bracelet, the very same bracelet bought with my stolen inheritance, flashed under the recessed lighting as she hit him again and again. "You ruined my life," Chloe sobbed frantically, tearing at Chad's shirt collar. "You promised me a lifestyle. You promised me I would never have to worry about money. I am pregnant, you absolute loser. I am carrying your child, and you just made me an accessory to federal wire fraud. I am going to have my baby in a prison hospital because you were too stupid to manage a basic investment portfolio." Chad threw his arms up over his head, cowering on the floor like a terrified child. The man who had strutted into my home 30 minutes ago, radiating white privilege and unearned superiority, was now weeping openly on my floor. He kicked his legs, trying to push Chloe away, his face red and splotchy with tears. "It was not my idea," Chad screamed, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling finger directly at Vivian. I did not want to do this. I was going to declare bankruptcy and face the civil penalties. She is the one who came up with the blackmail plan. She made me do it. Vivian gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically shot. She stared at her precious son-in-law, completely blindsided by his instant betrayal. Chad, what are you saying? Vivian stammered, her eyes darting frantically toward the television screen where the federal agent was documenting every single word. Tell them the truth, Chad yelled, completely throwing my mother to the wolves to save his own skin. You were terrified of losing your social standing. You were crying about how your friends at the Jack and Jill alumni board would find out your daughter married a broke fraud. You told me Marcus was an easy target because he was just a street kid who stumbled into tech money. You drafted those fake press releases, Vivian. You told me you would ruin my life if I did not help you extort Marcus for the $5 million. You forced me to bring that folder here today. You ungrateful lying coward, Vivian roared, her pristine image fracturing into a million pieces. I stole my own daughter's trust fund to give you a career. I handed you everything on a silver platter so you could provide for Chloe. You squandered it all on your own pathetic incompetence, and now you dare to blame me. I did everything for this family. I protected our legacy. Your legacy is a federal indictment, Vivian Marcus said, his voice cold and relentless. You can argue about who drafted the paperwork all you want. Prosecutors do not care who had the idea first. Vivian and Chad signed the ransom note. Jerome designed the threat campaign. Chloe stood here endorsing it while demanding money. Every one of you left a different piece of evidence, and every piece points back to the same extortion scheme. Chloe collapsed onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands and sobbing violently. Her entire world was gone. There would be no Martha's Vineyard. There would be no private preschools or elite social clubs. She was married to a disgraced bankrupt fraud with her words preserved in a federal investigation. Vivian stood trembling in the center of the room. The golden child she had worshipped was currently having a mental breakdown on my couch. The white savior son-in-law she had bought and paid for was currently weeping on my floor and actively testifying against her to a federal agent on a live feed. The grand matriarch, who had controlled every narrative and manipulated every outcome for 3 decades, had absolutely no one left to manipulate. She turned her desperate, panicked eyes toward the only person in the room who had always folded under her pressure. She looked at Jerome. Jerome, honey. Vivian pleaded, her voice dropping into a frantic whisper. Tell them I only wanted what was best for the family. Tell them I did not force Chad to do anything. We have to stick together, Jerome. You have to tell the police that Chad is lying to save himself. We have to hire lawyers. We can fight this. My father was standing near the entryway, his face slick with a cold, terrified sweat. He looked at Vivian, then he looked at the television screen displaying the federal seal. He looked down at his own trembling hands, and then finally he looked at me. Jerome saw the absolute, merciless conviction in my eyes. He knew I had the digital forensics proving he was the one who sent those emails to the press from his home computer. He knew he was the architect of the plan to weaponize Child Protective Services against little Maya. He was staring directly at a 20-year prison sentence, and his self-preservation instincts finally overrode 40 years of subservience to his wife. I am not taking the fall for this, Vivian, Jerome shouted, backing away from her, holding his hands up as if she were carrying a contagious disease. I told you this was a terrible idea. I told you Marcus was too smart to fall for a shakedown. You forced me to send those emails. You stood over my shoulder in the study and threatened to divorce me and take the house if I did not type exactly what you said. I was under extreme duress. Vivian's mouth fell open. She looked at her husband with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. Jerome, you spineless traitor, you were the one who suggested we target the child. You said Marcus would fold immediately if we threatened to call social services on the little girl. You said a black man in America would never risk a run-in with child welfare. You came up with that. I had nothing to do with this, Jerome screamed, his voice cracking with pure cowardice. He literally turned his back on his wife, scrambling toward the front door, trying to figure out how to escape a penthouse on the 40th floor. I was manipulated. I am a victim here. Nia, tell them I am a victim. I am your father. I love you, Nia. I never wanted to hurt you. The sheer pathetic hypocrisy of his words made me physically nauseous. He was willing to destroy my family an hour ago, and now he was begging for my protection while actively throwing his wife under a bus. The entire alliance of toxic abusers had completely cannibalized itself in under 5 minutes. They were a pack of starving wolves locked in a cage, tearing each other to pieces the second they realized there was no escape. Vivian stood completely alone in the center of the wreckage. Her husband had abandoned her. Her son-in-law had betrayed her. Her golden child was weeping uncontrollably. She slowly turned her head, looking around the luxurious penthouse that she had tried to buy her way into. She finally locked eyes with me. There was no motherly love in her stare. There was no regret for stealing my money or abandoning me. There was only the stark, terrifying realization that I was the one holding the executioner's axe. Vivian grasped at the collar of her cashmere coat, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling violently as she tried to pull air into her lungs. The sheer magnitude of the federal charges bearing down on her manifested as a physical weight crushing her chest. She let out a ragged, gasping sound, staggering forward until her knees hit the imported hardwood floor with a heavy thud. The proud, dictatorial matriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist for decades was completely gone. In her place was a terrified, desperate woman staring up at me from the floor. "Nia, please," Vivian choked out, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and cutting through her flawless makeup. She reached a shaking hand out toward my shoes, not quite daring to touch me. "You cannot do this. You cannot let them take me away. I am your mother, Nia. I carried you for 9 months. I gave you life." She was playing the absolute last card she had left in her deck. The sacred, unassailable bond of motherhood. It was the same manipulative tactic she had used to control my father to brainwash Chloe and to keep me chasing her impossible standards for my entire youth. "Everything I did was for this family." Vivian sobbed, her voice pitching into a hysterical frenzy as she glanced frantically between me and the massive television screen where the federal agents were silently watching her every move. "Do you know how hard it is to maintain our position in this society, Nia? Do you know how quickly they judge people who look like us the second we slip up? I had to protect our reputation. I had to make sure Chloe married well so our lineage would be secure. I sacrificed everything to build a name that commanded respect. You cannot let your own flesh and blood go to a federal prison over a misunderstanding. Tell them, Nia. Tell the men on the screen that this was just a private family dispute. Tell them I am your mother and we are handling it internally." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping woman on my floor. I did not feel a single twinge of guilt. I did not feel the familiar childhood urge to comfort her or smooth over the situation. I slowly turned my back on her and walked over to the custom wet bar tucked into the corner of the living room. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, broken only by Chloe's muffled weeping from the sofa and Chad's ragged breathing. I picked up a crystal tumbler and poured myself a small measure of red wine. The dark liquid swirled in the glass, catching the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the rich flavor ground me in the present moment. I turned back around, holding the glass in one hand, my posture completely relaxed. "Reputation?" I asked, my voice echoing off the glass walls, cold and sharp as a newly sharpened blade. "You are kneeling on my floor, begging for mercy, in the name of a reputation that was built entirely on a foundation of theft and lies." I took a few slow steps back toward the center of the room, looking directly into Vivian's terrified eyes. "You talk about the sacrifices you made to protect this family." I continued, my tone devoid of any warmth or forgiveness. "But your idea of protection was draining your own daughter's inheritance to buy your way into an elite social circle. Your idea of protecting our name was orchestrating a smear campaign against a self-made black man who actually works to protect this country's financial infrastructure. You did not do any of this for us, Vivian. You did it to feed your own bottomless greed." Vivian shook her head wildly, her tears dripping onto the expensive rug. "No, Nia, you have to understand, I was trying to save you too. I was trying to secure a future for all of us." "Do not dare use the word future with me." I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip, making Jerome jump in the background. "You stripped away my future the day you forged my signature and stole my college fund. You threw me to the wolves because I refused to be a prop in your country club fantasies. And you just stood in my living room less than an hour ago and looked at a photograph of a motherless 3-year-old girl and called her extra baggage. I pointed a finger directly at Vivian, my eyes burning with a fierce protective fire. You threatened to call Child Protective Services on an innocent little girl. You threatened to have Maya ripped away from the only family she has ever known just so you could extort $5 million to save a white hedge fund manager who actively despises you. You were perfectly willing to destroy a black child's life to protect Chad's privilege. Vivian opened her mouth to argue, to spin another desperate lie, but the words died in her throat. She looked up at my face and saw the absolute finality written there. She was staring at a woman who had completely outgrown the need for her mother's toxic approval. "You gave birth to me," I said, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet whisper that commanded the attention of every single person in the room, including the federal agents watching through the secure feed. "You provided the biology, but you buried that motherhood yourself 5 years ago when you chose your social status over my survival. You are not my mother, Vivian. You are just a criminal who broke into my home." Vivian collapsed forward, pressing her forehead against the floor, letting out a loud, agonizing wail of total defeat. The grand illusion was entirely shattered. She was completely broken, stripped of her wealth, her golden child, her husband, and her freedom. I took another slow sip of my wine, tasting the absolute perfection of the moment. I had reclaimed my power. I had protected my husband and my daughter. I had dismantled the generational curse of my toxic family with surgical precision. But the execution was not quite finished. A sound suddenly pierced through the heavy atmosphere of the penthouse. It started as a faint, distant noise drifting up through the floor-to-ceiling windows from the busy Chicago streets 40 stories below. The sound rapidly grew louder, multiplying and echoing off the surrounding skyscrapers. It was the sharp, piercing wail of police sirens. Not just one vehicle, but a massive coordinated fleet of sirens screaming through the downtown traffic, approaching our building with terrifying speed. Chad scrambled up onto his knees, his eyes wide with fresh horror as the flashing red and blue lights began to reflect faintly against the glass walls of my living room. Chloe stopped crying, freezing completely as she listened to the approaching authorities. Jerome backed up against the wall, looking frantically toward the private elevator doors. I turned my head and looked at Marcus. My husband stood perfectly calm, his hands resting easily in the pockets of his tailored trousers. He had not touched his phone since he initiated the video call with the Securities and Exchange Commission. He had not given a verbal command to dispatch law enforcement. The federal agents on the screen had mentioned they were sending a team, but the speed and the sheer volume of the sirens indicated a massive pre-planned operation. The police had not just been dispatched, they had been waiting. They had been sitting in position blocks away, ready to swarm the building the exact second the trap was sprung. I looked at the brilliant, calculating man I had married, my heart swelling with a profound sense of awe. When exactly had Marcus pressed the button to summon the police? How long had this masterstroke been quietly sitting in the palm of his hand, waiting for the perfect moment to drop the final curtain on my abusers? The heavy oak doors of the penthouse did not chime this time. They shuddered under a series of loud, aggressive knocks that demanded immediate entry. Marcus walked over and pulled the handle back. A dozen armed individuals poured into the foyer. There were Chicago police officers in dark uniforms alongside federal marshals wearing tactical vests with federal insignias printed across their chests. The lead officer stepped forward, presenting a stack of thick legal documents. The flashing red and blue lights from the street below reflected against the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a frantic, rotating glow over the terrified faces of my family. The SEC investigator on the video feed had not exaggerated. The authorities moved with absolute precision. A Chicago police commander entered with the arrest warrants, while federal marshals secured the room. One marshal approached Chad, who was still struggling to pull himself up from the floor, and read the financial fraud and extortion charges aloud. Chad completely lost his mind. The reality of the metal handcuffs coming toward his wrists caused his brain to short-circuit. He scrambled backward, kicking his expensive Italian loafers against the hardwood floor. "You cannot touch me!" Chad screamed, his voice echoing with absolute disbelief. "Do you know who my father is? I am a legacy fund manager. You have no jurisdiction here. I demand to speak to my attorney immediately. You cannot just walk into a private residence and arrest a man of my standing on the word of a black tech developer. This is a massive violation of my civil rights. The federal marshal did not care about Chad's grandfather or his Wharton degree. He grabbed Chad by the shoulder of his custom navy suit and forcefully spun him around. Chad fought back, throwing a wild, clumsy punch that missed the marshal entirely. It was the worst possible decision he could have made. In less than 2 seconds, the marshal swept Chad's legs out from under him and slammed him face first into the floor. The sharp sound of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Chad's wrists was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. Chad lay there pressing his bleeding cheek against my rug, sobbing uncontrollably as his white privilege completely failed to protect him from the consequences of his own arrogance. 2 Chicago police officers moved toward Jerome. My father did not fight. He simply raised his trembling hands in the air, openly weeping. "Please, I was forced into this," Jerome cried out as the officers pulled his arms behind his back. "I am a victim of manipulation. My wife made me send those emails. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I am a good man. I have a clean record. You are being placed under arrest for conspiracy to commit extortion and cyber harassment," an officer stated, completely ignoring Jerome's pathetic whining. My father, the man who had stood by silently while I was emotionally abused for 3 decades, was now being dragged out of my home crying like a frightened child. Then the officers turned their attention to Vivian. My mother took a step backward, pulling her pristine cashmere coat tightly around her shoulders, as if the expensive fabric could somehow shield her from the law. "Do not put your hands on me," Vivian snapped, glaring at the female officer approaching her. "I am a respected member of this community. I sit on the board of the Regional Country Club. I will walk out of here under my own power, but I will not be paraded out of this building in handcuffs like a common street criminal." "Ma'am, put your hands behind your back," the officer ordered, stepping into Vivian's personal space. "I said do not touch me," Vivian shrieked, attempting to slap the officer's hands away. The response was immediate. The officer grabbed Vivian's wrist, twisted it firmly behind her back, and slammed her face first against the glass surface of the living room wall. Vivian gasped in pain and shock as the cold steel cuffs locked around her wrists. The grand matriarch of our family, the woman who was completely obsessed with flawless optics and high society etiquette, was now pressed against a window, with her cheeks smashed against the glass, while the entire city of Chicago rotated below her. Chloe was not named in the immediate arrest warrants, but the reality of her shattered life finally broke her. She fell to her knees in the center of the living room. Her husband was being hauled away to federal prison. Her parents were being arrested for extortion. The stolen trust fund money she had lived on for 5 years was gone. The $12 million Chad lost meant the government would seize all her assets, her house, her cars, her designer wardrobe. She had absolutely nothing left. Chloe crawled across the floor toward me. She reached out, grabbing the hem of my pants, her face completely drenched in tears and ruined makeup. "Nia, please," Chloe begged, her voice cracking into a desperate, hysterical sob. "You have to help me. You have to tell them to stop. Chad needs a lawyer. Mom and Dad need bail money. I do not have access to any of the accounts. They are all frozen. You have to post bail for them, Nia. You have to pay for Chad's defense." I looked down at the golden child, the sister who had mocked my husband's background an hour ago, the sister who had actively participated in a plot to traumatize an innocent 8-year-old girl. "You want me to finance the legal defense of the people who just tried to destroy my family?" I asked, my voice echoing with pure icy detachment. Chloe sobbed harder, tightening her grip on my clothes. "I am pregnant, Nia. I am carrying your niece or nephew. You cannot let my baby be born while its father is in a federal penitentiary. You cannot let me lose my home. I have never worked a day in my life, Nia. I do not know how to survive out there. I need your help. We are blood. You cannot just abandon a pregnant woman on the street." I reached down and firmly pried her fingers off my pants, stepping backward so she was left grasping at empty air. "You are right, Chloe," I said, looking down at her pathetic, trembling form. "You are pregnant, and you are going to raise that child exactly the way you always mocked Marcus for raising Maya. You are going to raise that child on a strict budget. You are going to learn how to shop at discount grocery stores. You are going to apply for entry-level jobs and pray they do not run a background check and see your name associated with the largest financial fraud scandal of the decade. You are going to experience the exact same struggle you laughed at us for enduring. But I cannot do that, Chloe wailed, shaking her head frantically. I am not built for that kind of life. I am a luxury lifestyle influencer. Then you better start influencing yourself into a new reality, I replied sharply, shutting down her delusion. Because I am not giving you a single dime. The money you spent on your diamond tennis bracelet was stolen from my college fund. The down payment on your mansion was stolen from my inheritance. You have been living on my stolen future for 5 years, Chloe. Consider the financial faucet permanently turned off. The federal marshals began moving the prisoners toward the front door. Chad was hyperventilating, practically dragging his feet as they pulled him toward the hallway. Jerome was sobbing openly, his head hanging in total shame. But Vivian stopped in the doorway. She dug her heels into the floor, forcing the officers to halt for a fraction of a second. She turned her head and looked back at me. The pristine facade was completely gone. Her hair was messy, her expensive coat was twisted, and her wrists were bound behind her back. She looked at me, and the absolute venom in her eyes was terrifying. It was not the look of a mother who had made a mistake. It was the look of a predator who realized she had finally been outsmarted by her own prey. She was looking at a daughter who had just stripped away her wealth, her fake prestige, her social standing, and her freedom. You think you won? Vivian hissed, her voice dripping with a toxic, hateful malice. You think sending your own mother to prison makes you powerful. You are nothing but a traitor. You destroyed this family. You ruined our legacy. I curse the day you were born. I walked slowly toward the doorway, stopping just a few feet away from her. I looked directly into her hateful eyes and smiled. There is no legacy. Vivian, I said, my voice perfectly calm, ringing with the absolute truth. You are not a socialite. You are not elite. By tomorrow morning, your mugshot will be broadcast on every local news station in Chicago. The country club board will officially revoke your membership before you even make bail. Your wealthy friends will block your phone number because nobody wants to be associated with a woman arrested for extortion. You are going to sit in a concrete cell and realize that you traded your own daughter for a social status that never actually existed. I turned to the lead officer. Get them out of my house. The officers pulled Vivian forward. She tried to scream something else, but the heavy oak doors of the penthouse swung shut, cutting her off completely. The silence that rushed into the room was deafening. The chaos, the yelling, the threats, it was all instantly gone. Chloe was still sitting on the floor, weeping quietly into her hands, realizing that the doors had just closed on her entire universe. She was completely alone. Her mother, her father, and her husband were gone. And the sister she had abused her entire life was the only one holding all the power. I stood in the entryway, taking a deep breath of the quiet air. The smell of fear and panic was still lingering, but it was quickly fading. I turned back toward the living room to look at Marcus. My husband was standing by the glass windows looking out at the city skyline. He slowly turned his head to meet my gaze, and a silent, unspoken communication passed between us. The war was officially over. But there was still one piece of trash left on the floor that needed to be swept away. Marcus stepped forward and signaled to the 2 building security officers who had escorted the federal marshals up to our floor. He did not say a single word. He simply gestured toward Chloe, who was still sitting in the center of the living room, clutching her knees to her chest. The security officers understood the silent command immediately. They approached my sister, offering no sympathy as they instructed her to stand and vacate the premises. Chloe did not fight them. The arrogant, combative energy that had defined her entire existence had been completely drained from her body. The golden child who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate her own status simply let the security officers pull her to her feet. She looked like a hollow shell of the woman who had marched into my home an hour ago, demanding my money and my submission. She did not look at me as they guided her toward the foyer. She dragged her feet, staring blankly at the floor, her designer dress wrinkled, and her perfect life entirely dismantled. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse clicked shut behind her with a solid, resonating thud. The automatic deadbolts engaged, immediately sealing the perimeter. The silence that rushed into the room was profound. It was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of a tense standoff. It was the pure, unadulterated silence of a sanctuary that had finally been purged of a toxic infection. I stood in the center of my living room and let my eyes sweep across the space. The physical detritus of my family's invasion was scattered across the pristine environment Marcus and I had built together. There was a dark crimson stain blooming on the custom-imported rug where Chad had dropped his glass of wine in his initial moment of sheer terror. There were chaotic scuff marks and streaks of muddy slush dragged across the polished hardwood floors left behind by the expensive Italian loafers and designer heels of people who believed they were above wiping their feet. The heavy leather folder containing their pathetic blackmail attempt lay discarded on the glass coffee table, a monument to their spectacular failure. It was a physical mess, but looking at it filled me with an overwhelming sense of peace. Those spilled drinks and muddy footprints were the absolute last stains Vivian, Jerome, Chad, and Chloe would ever leave on my life. I could hire a cleaning service to scrub the floors and replace the rug by tomorrow afternoon. The emotional stains they had tried to scrub into my soul for 32 years had just been permanently eradicated. I took a deep, slow breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. The frantic adrenaline that had been keeping my posture rigid and my voice sharp finally began to recede. My shoulders dropped, dropping a weight I had been carrying since I was a little girl, desperate for a mother's love that was never going to come. I did not feel a single ounce of grief for the people who had just been dragged out of my home in handcuffs. I felt an incredible soaring lightness. The generational curse of seeking validation from a status-obsessed matriarch was unequivocally broken. I turned to look at Marcus. My husband was standing by the wet bar, rolling his shoulders and adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt. He picked up my half-empty crystal tumbler of wine from the counter and brought it over to me, handing it back with a soft, knowing smile. There was no need for grand declarations or dramatic speeches between us. The communication we shared in that quiet look transcended language. Marcus had not just protected my physical safety or our financial assets today. He had validated my worth in a way my biological family had actively refused to do my entire life. He had seen the exact scope of the trauma they inflicted, and instead of asking me to compromise or make peace, he had handed me the absolute power to destroy my abusers. He had been the steady, unbreakable wall at my back, allowing me to finally swing the hammer. I took the glass from his hand, my fingers brushing against his warm skin. "Thank you," I said, my voice soft but carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken emotions. Marcus gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, his touch infinitely tender, completely contrasting the ruthless predator he had been just moments ago. "You never have to thank me for defending my wife," Marcus replied, his dark eyes locking onto mine with fierce devotion. "They thought you were alone, Nia. They thought you were unprotected because you refused to play their toxic games. They made a fatal miscalculation." The sudden soft click of a door handle turning broke the quiet intimacy of the moment. We both turned our heads toward the hallway leading to the master suites. The heavy wooden door pushed open slowly, the hinges completely silent. Maya stepped out into the hallway. My brilliant, sweet 8-year-old stepdaughter stood there, rubbing the sleep from her eyes with one small hand, while the other tightly clutched her favorite worn-out teddy bear. She was wearing her soft pink pajamas, her natural hair braided neatly in protective styles I had spent an hour doing for her just last night. She looked so incredibly small, standing in the vast corridor of the penthouse, completely oblivious to the absolute war that had just been waged and won on her behalf in the adjacent room. I looked at Maya, and the memory of Vivian's cruel voice echoed briefly in my mind. Extra baggage. My mother had stood in this very room an hour ago and called this beautiful, innocent child extra baggage. Vivian had threatened to call Child Protective Services to have this little girl ripped away from the only stable home she had ever known just to cover up a white man's financial crimes. Vivian had looked at Maya and seen nothing but a disposable pawn, a target to be exploited for social leverage. A fierce, overwhelming wave of maternal love crashed over me, completely washing away any lingering residue of the afternoon's darkness. Maya padded softly across the hardwood floor, her bare feet avoiding the scuff marks left by the intruders. She walked straight past the spilled wine and the discarded blackmail folder, completely uninterested in the mess. She walked directly up to Marcus and leaned heavily against his leg, letting out a soft, tired yawn. Daddy, Maya mumbled, her voice thick with sleep, pressing her face against his suit trousers. It is loud out there. I heard sirens. Marcus smiled, a look of pure, unconditional love transforming his entire face. He rested his large hand on the top of her head, smoothing his thumb over her braids. It was just a little traffic down on the street, baby girl, Marcus said, his voice vibrating with comforting warmth. Everything is perfectly fine. The sirens are gone now. Maya nodded sleepily, accepting her father's protection as an absolute universal truth. Then she turned her head and looked up at me. Her dark brown eyes were wide and trusting, completely devoid of the judgment or expectation I had grown up with. She did not look at me as a stepmother or as a woman failing to meet a society standard. She just looked at me as her safe place. Mommy, Maya said, holding her little arms up toward me. The word struck me right in the center of my chest. It was the greatest title I had ever earned. It was not a title bestowed by blood or genetics. It was a title earned through patience, consistency, and genuine unconditional love. It was everything Vivian had completely failed to understand about motherhood. I immediately set my wine glass down on the nearest table. I stepped forward and crouched down, ignoring the high-end fabric of my trousers brushing against the floor. I wrapped my arms around Maya's small frame and lifted her up, pulling her warm, sleepy weight securely against my chest. She instantly buried her face in the crook of my neck, wrapping her arms tightly around my shoulders, while her teddy bear squished softly between us. I closed my eyes, inhaling the sweet, innocent scent of her lavender hair oil. I pressed a long, gentle kiss to her forehead, letting my lips linger against her skin. I held her with the fierce, unyielding protection of a woman who had just scorched the earth to keep her safe. You are safe, my sweet girl, I whispered, my voice thick with raw emotion, holding her just a fraction tighter. Nobody is ever going to hurt you. Nobody is ever going to make you feel like you do not belong in this family. I promise you. I stood up slowly, easily, supporting Maya's weight on my hip. She rested her head back against my shoulder, already drifting back toward sleep, now that she knew her world was completely secure. I felt a solid, warm presence step up close behind me. Marcus moved in, closing the physical distance between us. He wrapped his strong arms around my waist from behind, pulling my back flush against his chest. He enveloped both me and Maya in a tight, protective embrace, a physical shield surrounding the life we had chosen to build together. I leaned back into my husband, resting my head against his shoulder, while keeping my arms firmly wrapped around our daughter. We stood there in the center of the living room, completely surrounded by the wreckage of the people who had tried to destroy us. The room was messy, the rug was stained, and the echoes of the police sirens had barely faded from the city streets below. But none of that mattered. The contrast was absolutely striking. The biological family that was supposed to protect me had just been hauled away in handcuffs, consumed by their own greed and toxicity. But the family standing in the center of this room, the family built on mutual respect, fierce loyalty, and authentic love, was shining brilliantly. We were completely unbroken. We were standing in the light of our own truth, completely victorious. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Chicago skyline, glittering against the afternoon sky. I did not need to say a single word. Marcus held me tighter, anchoring me in the beautiful, quiet reality of our victory. The past was permanently erased, and our future was entirely ours to write. 6 months have passed since the heavy oak doors of our penthouse closed on my biological family forever. The crisp Chicago morning sun is pouring into the executive suite of my newly expanded corporate communications firm. I am sitting behind a polished mahogany desk, wearing a tailored emerald green suit that perfectly matches the absolute tranquility I feel every single day. I reach forward and tap the screen of my iPad. The morning financial news broadcast instantly fills the quiet room. The anchor is leading with the highest-profile white-collar crime conviction of the year. The screen displays courtroom sketches and mugshots that I have practically memorized. The first face belongs to Chad, The arrogant hedge fund manager, who believed his white privilege and his Ivy League pedigree made him completely untouchable, is now wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The news anchor reports his final sentence with clinical precision: 20 years in federal prison. During the trial, Chad tried every trick in the book. He cried in front of the federal judge. He blamed the volatile market. He tried to blame my mother. He even tried to leverage his grandfather's historical reputation in the banking sector. But the judge looked right through him. The signed extortion demand and the digital trail of the Cayman Islands routing numbers were absolute undeniable proof. Chad was stripped of his financial licenses, stripped of his assets, and stripped of his dignity. The man who stood in my living room and mocked my husband for his background is now sitting in a concrete cell, realizing that his generational wealth was nothing but an illusion built on fraud. The broadcast smoothly transitions to the co-conspirators in the extortion plot: Vivian and Jerome, my parents. Their cases went through court under the weight of the signed demand, the recorded threats, and Jerome's digital trail. The criminal judgments and civil restitution orders dismantled what remained of their lives. Their suburban mansion was seized to satisfy restitution for the money taken from my trust and the losses tied to the scheme. Their accounts were frozen and drained under court supervision. But for Vivian, the financial ruin was only a fraction of the punishment. Her true prison is the social death she is currently enduring. The elite Black society clubs she worshipped, the organizations she used as weapons to make me feel inferior, publicly disavowed her. The Regional Country Club officially revoked their membership, releasing a statement condemning their involvement in the extortion scheme. The wealthy friends she spent decades trying to impress instantly blocked her phone number. Vivian and Jerome are now living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. They have no assets, no status, and no audience left to manipulate. Jerome works a grueling night shift as a security guard just to keep the lights on, while Vivian sits in their tiny living room, completely isolated, surrounded by the ghosts of a reputation she destroyed with her own greed. And then there is Chloe, the golden child, the sister who spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate her own position. With Chad locked away in a federal facility and his assets entirely seized by the government, Chloe was left with absolutely nothing. The designer bags, the luxury vehicles, the promised summer home in Martha's Vineyard, all of it vanished into thin air. She was forced to face the harsh reality of the real world without a single safety net. Just last week, a mutual acquaintance sent me a photograph they discreetly took at a discount grocery store. It showed Chloe standing behind a cash register wearing a stiff polyester uniform. She looked exhausted, her hair pulled back into a messy knot, scanning canned goods and bagging groceries for minimum wage. The poetic justice is almost overwhelming. The woman who stood in my home and demanded $5 million, the sister who casually suggested I should be grateful to be tolerated by her high-class family, is now spending 8 hours a day standing on her feet, learning the value of a single dollar the hard way. She is raising her child in a small rented duplex, finally experiencing the exact same struggles she used to ruthlessly mock other people for surviving. I turn off the iPad. The screen goes completely black, cutting off the news broadcast and leaving a perfect reflection of my face. I look calm, centered, and entirely unbothered. I stand up from my desk and walk slowly toward the massive window overlooking the bustling city streets below. The camera follows me, gliding smoothly across the room until it pushes in close, capturing the steady, confident look in my eyes. I turn away from the window and look directly into the lens, breaking the invisible barrier between my world and yours. They always thought I was the weak one, I say, my voice steady and ringing with absolute truth. They confused my silence for submission. They thought my desire for peace meant I lacked the capacity for war. For 32 years, they believed that because I refused to follow their toxic rules, because I refused to play their manipulative games, I was somehow an easy target. They genuinely thought that unearned privilege, the color of a man's skin, or the oppressive dictatorship of a narcissistic family structure could completely crush me. They relied on the old, outdated playbook of guilt trips and emotional blackmail, assuming I would always fold just to keep the peace. I let out a soft, knowing smile, shaking my head slightly at the sheer arrogance of their miscalculation. But they forgot one very important thing. I continue my gaze locking intensely with the camera. When you back a woman into a corner, when you threaten her husband, her child, and her hard-earned peace, she does not just roll over and cry. She does not drop to her knees and beg for mercy from the very people holding the knife. She analyzes the room, she calculates the odds, she buys the entire casino, and she completely changes the rules. I take a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute freedom radiating through my veins. My family is thriving. Maya is growing up in a home filled with unconditional love, and Marcus continues to build an empire based on actual merit and hard work. We are untouchable because we are authentic. I give the camera one last triumphant smile, a smile that holds the weight of every tear I ever shed and every victory I ever claimed. The sweet revenge is not just watching them fall. The ultimate revenge is living a brilliant, beautiful life they can no longer touch. The camera slowly pulls back, leaving me standing perfectly tall in the sunlight as the screen